The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the quiet park. The air was crisp, but not too cold, the perfect end to another day. Emma sat contentedly in her favorite spot, a small patch of grass near the swings, where the sounds of children playing and birds chirping filled the air. Her wheelchair was pushed to the side, as she rested her hands on the wheels, simply soaking in the serenity. She wasn't in a rush to go anywhere. Her joy came from the simple things, the way the leaves swayed in the breeze, the colorful flowers in full bloom, and the laughter of families enjoying their evening. Even with her disability, Emma never let it hold her back. Her world was full of beauty, and she saw things others often overlooked. The park, with its open spaces and endless possibilities, had become a sanctuary, a place where she could feel free, where she didn't have to worry about being stared at or treated differently. To her, the park was home. She hummed softly to herself as her brother played nearby, occasionally glancing over at her to make sure she was okay. Their parents, sitting a few feet away on the park bench, exchanged quiet conversation, knowing their children were safe. It felt like any other evening, a calm, peaceful moment to simply exist in the comfort of each other's presence. For a brief moment, everything felt perfect. The world seemed to slow down, as if the universe was giving them this one tranquil moment to enjoy. There were no worries, no fears. Just Emma and the park, her world as it should be. But beneath the calm, something darker was stirring, something none of them could see yet. The world was about to shift, and the peace they had so carefully built was about to be shattered in an instant. In that perfect, serene moment, Emma had no idea that her life was about to change forever. Karen appeared as if out of nowhere, walking briskly along the park's pathway with her usual air of superiority. She wore a sharp, tightly buttoned jacket, and her eyes were narrowed, scanning the surroundings with the sort of critical gaze that always made others feel like they didn't measure up. As she walked past Emma, sitting on the grass, she muttered something under her breath, words that Emma couldn't quite hear but still made her stomach tighten. It wasn't the first time Karen had given them that look, that disapproving, cold gaze that seemed to say you don't belong here. Emma tried to ignore her, focusing on the simple joy of the moment, but the unease lingered in the air like an ominous cloud. In the past few weeks, Karen's presence had become a constant source of tension in the park. Emma had always loved coming here, but more and more, she had begun to sense Karen's eyes on her whenever she tried to enjoy her time outside. From the first day they moved into the neighborhood, Karen had made her distaste known, complaining about the noise Emma's wheelchair made on the sidewalk, criticizing the way she navigated the park, even going so far as to say that children like Emma didn't belong in public spaces. The first few times, Emma's parents had brushed it off, telling her not to let Karen's words bother her. But over time, the complaints became more frequent, more personal. Emma's laughter was a nuisance, her wheelchair was an eyesore, and Karen made it known that she wanted them to stay out of her view. She had made multiple calls to the HOA, demanding that Emma be restricted from using the park's pathways, and had even gotten other neighbors to sign petitions, claiming that Emma's presence was disrupting the peaceful environment of the community. Emma's parents had done their best to shield her from the hostility, but it was hard. They knew Karen's complaints weren't just about the noise or the space Emma occupied, they were about something much darker. Karen couldn't tolerate someone who didn't fit into her narrow vision of what the neighborhood should be. And Emma, in her wheelchair, didn't fit that vision. Emma's innocence and joy had become a target for Karen's bitterness. As Karen passed by now, there was no mistaking the way she looked at Emma, her lips curling into a sneer. She slowed just enough to make sure Emma saw her cold stare, her eyes filled with disdain. Emma glanced up, meeting her gaze for a brief moment before quickly looking away, feeling a tightness in her chest. She had grown used to this feeling of unease whenever Karen was near, but today, it seemed sharper, more pronounced. Karen's hatred for Emma was undeniable now, and Emma could feel it in every glance, every word. The tension in the park seemed to thicken, and even the air around Emma felt heavier. She couldn't explain it, but something in her gut told her today was different. She had always feared that one day, the simmering animosity would boil over, but she had hoped it never would. She had hoped that Karen's bitterness would remain just that, words, complaints, fleeting moments of cruelty. But deep down, Emma knew something far worse was brewing. As Karen continued on her way, Emma turned back to watch her, her thoughts racing. She felt trapped, as if the park, which had once been her sanctuary, was slowly turning into a battlefield. The weight of Karen's anger hung in the air, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The peace of the moment was slipping away, replaced by a sense of dread. And as Karen disappeared into the distance, Emma couldn't help but wonder if this would be the day everything changed. The park, once a sanctuary of peace, suddenly felt suffocating. Emma, still lost in the moment, didn't see Karen approaching from behind. The sound of footsteps was drowned out by the laughter of children playing and the rustling of the trees in the evening breeze. But Emma's heart skipped a beat when she felt a shift in the air, a subtle, chilling presence that made her stomach tighten. She turned her head just in time to see Karen standing there, her face devoid of any emotion, her hands tucked behind her back. For a split second, there was only silence, a silence that seemed to stretch on forever, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then, with a sudden, calculated motion, Karen pulled a long, steel pipe from behind her back. Before Emma could even react, Karen swung the pipe with all her strength. The metallic thud of the pipe connecting with Emma's side rang through the park, a sound that cut through the ambient noise like a knife. Emma's body crumpled to the ground, the pain radiating through her like an electric shock, leaving her breathless and disoriented. Blood began to pool around her, staining the grass a deep crimson, and the world around her blurred. For a moment, she couldn't move, her body was frozen, trapped in the agony of the blow. She gasped for air, her heart pounding, but the pain was too much. She could barely hear the sounds of the park anymore, only the pounding in her own ears and the faint, dizzying whir of her thoughts. Her vision swam in and out of focus, and she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. Karen stood over her, watching coldly. Her eyes, once filled with disdain, now glimmered with something darker, satisfaction. She didn't show the slightest hint of remorse or regret. She was calm, as if she were simply completing a task, indifferent to the suffering she had caused. There was no remorse, no apology, just cold, cruel detachment. Karen took a step back, watching as Emma's body lay helplessly on the ground, her chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Emma's hand reached weakly toward the ground, trying to steady herself, but it was like her body no longer obeyed her. The park around her, full of people just moments before, felt suddenly empty. No one moved to help. No one even looked twice at the child lying in a pool of her own blood. The few people nearby glanced briefly at the scene but quickly turned away, some shaking their heads, others too distracted to notice the violence unfolding right in front of them. The silence of the park was now deafening, the air heavy with the weight of indifference. Karen stood there for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on Emma, before turning and walking away as if she had done nothing at all. She didn't rush, didn't even look back. She just left, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Emma behind like a discarded doll. The world, it seemed, had moved on without her. And in that moment, Emma realized that no one was coming to save her. No one was going to intervene. She was alone, bleeding, abandoned in the middle of a park full of people who refused to see her. The world had turned its back on her in an instant. The fear, the disbelief, the terror, it all hit her in a single wave. The strength to cry out, to call for help, seemed to fade with every passing second, and she felt her body begin to surrender to the pain. With every labored breath, Emma could feel her strength slipping away, the darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. She wanted to scream, to ask for help, but the words wouldn't come. She could barely move, and all she could do was lie there, fighting to stay conscious. The park, so full of life moments before, now felt like a tomb. No one had moved to help. No one had stepped forward to stop what had happened. She had been left to die in the open, abandoned by everyone who should have been there. The very people who walked past her, who saw her in pain, did nothing. Emma lay in the dirt, helpless and terrified, and the world around her seemed to continue as if nothing had happened at all. Emma lay motionless on the cold, unforgiving ground, her body trembling in pain, every breath a struggle. The world around her felt distant, muffled, as if she were trapped in a fog, separated from reality by the overwhelming agony coursing through her. Her vision blurred, shifting in and out of focus as she tried desperately to hold on. The pain was unbearable, a fire that consumed her body, and yet, she could hardly make a sound. Her limbs felt numb, her muscles too weak to move. She tried to cry out for help, but her voice wouldn't come, only a ragged breath, the kind that comes when a person knows they are in danger but cannot escape it. Her throat burned, and her chest tightened as the world around her seemed to spin out of control. Every time she tried to lift her head, her vision swam further into darkness. The park was still alive with the sounds of laughter and conversation, but for Emma, the noise was faint, almost surreal. She could hear the footsteps of people walking past, see the occasional silhouette of someone glancing her way, but no one stopped. No one cared. A man in a red jacket walked by, barely glancing in her direction, his face set in that cold, oblivious mask that told Emma everything she needed to know. Another woman, pushing a stroller, slowed for just a second, looking at the scene before her eyes flicked to the ground and she continued on her way, as if Emma's bleeding body was nothing more than an inconvenience in her path. It was as if the world had turned its back on her, just another inconvenience, something to ignore, to walk around. Emma's heart twisted in her chest, the realization settling like a heavy stone. Why wasn't anyone helping? Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Why had Karen done this? Why was she left alone? The pain was too much to think clearly, but Emma couldn't stop her thoughts from spiraling. She looked around, half blind with fear and blood loss, but there was nothing. Nothing but the indifferent park, the trees swaying in the wind, the distant sound of children laughing. Where was her family? Where was anyone? She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but all she could muster was a faint, choked gasp that seemed to disappear into the void. The crowd moved around her, but no one acknowledged her suffering. It was like she didn't exist, just a faceless figure, lying forgotten on the grass. The desperation grew with every passing second. Her body refused to obey her. Her arms felt heavy, her hands numb and unresponsive. She tried to reach for something, anything that could pull her out of this nightmare, but her fingers barely moved. She could feel the blood pooling beneath her, soaking into the ground, but it didn't matter. The world was still moving around her, people going about their day as if nothing had happened, oblivious to her suffering. She closed her eyes briefly, hoping that when she opened them, things would be different, that someone would be there, someone would care. But when she opened them again, nothing had changed. The world was still indifferent. She blinked rapidly, trying to stay awake, trying to focus on anything to keep herself from slipping away. The pain was unbearable, but the worst part was the isolation, the feeling of being alone, abandoned in the middle of a crowd. It was as if the universe had left her behind, cast aside like a broken doll. Her thoughts became muddled, and she struggled to hold on to the fleeting awareness she still had. The only thing that kept her tethered to this world was the thought of her family, her parents, her brother, the people who loved her. She had to hold on for them. She had to survive. But the longer she lay there, the more her strength waned. The tears in her eyes were mixed with blood, but no one was there to wipe them away. She was a child, helpless and alone, surrounded by people who saw but didn't see, who heard but didn't listen. She thought she saw a figure in the distance, someone coming toward her, but as quickly as the hope ignited, it flickered and died. The figure turned away, as if it had never seen her. Emma's body trembled harder, the cold beginning to seep into her bones. She was fading, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Nothing but the silence, the unbearable silence of abandonment as the evening wore on, the family's routine started to unravel. Emma's brother, Alex, glanced up from his game of catch with their dad, his face suddenly clouded with concern. He looked toward the park and then back at the house. "Where's Emma?" he asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. His parents exchanged quick glances, each of them assuming the other had seen Emma. It had been nearly an hour since Emma had gone to the park, and it wasn't like her to stay away for so long. Her parents had been chatting quietly on the porch, unaware that their daughter had been in danger. They thought she was still enjoying her usual evening routine in the park, but as the minutes stretched on, a nagging sense of unease began to settle in. Her mother, Maria, stood up abruptly, her instincts kicking in. "I'll check on her," she said, the calmness in her voice not matching the anxiety slowly creeping through her chest. As she walked to the edge of the yard, the familiar sights of the neighborhood no longer felt safe. The park that had once been a place of joy now seemed foreboding, its distant swings swaying slowly in the breeze, the shadows lengthening with the setting sun. Maria's heart raced, but she tried to shake off the feeling of dread. "She's fine," she thought, just lost track of time. But as she walked closer to the park, the absence of Emma's cheerful voice or her familiar laugh only made the worry grow heavier. Inside, Alex began to pace, nervously checking his phone as if expecting some miracle text from his sister. Their father, Daniel, who had always been calm in stressful situations, now stood by the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. His worry quickly turned into concern when he realized it had been too long since Emma had gone to the park. "She's not back yet," he muttered, his voice tense. Maria reached the edge of the park and called out for Emma, her voice growing louder with each passing second. "Emma! Sweetheart, where are you?" But there was no reply. The park, once so full of life, seemed strangely silent now, its usual hum of activity reduced to a faint rustling of the leaves in the wind. Maria's steps quickened, her eyes scanning the area desperately. The longer she searched, the more her pulse quickened. Why wasn't she here? Where was Emma? Her search brought her to the far corner of the park, where she had never imagined she would find her daughter. And then, through the trees, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, lying motionless on the ground, was Emma. Her wheelchair had been pushed aside, and blood was spreading beneath her, staining the grass around her. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside Emma, her hands trembling as she cradled her daughter's head in her lap. "Emma! Oh my God, Emma!" she cried, her voice breaking with terror. Emma's eyes fluttered open for a moment, but she couldn't speak. Her lips were pale, and her face was covered in blood. "Mom! I'm sorry," she whispered faintly, barely able to move, her voice weak and strained. Maria's heart broke. Emma's small body trembled, but she couldn't protect her. Her child had been left to die in this park, ignored and abandoned. The panic surged inside her, but Maria fought to stay calm for Emma. She yelled for help, screaming at the top of her lungs for anyone to hear, but no one responded. The park was still full of people, but no one came. No one even looked in their direction. The world seemed to ignore them, as if Emma's suffering didn't matter. Daniel and Alex finally arrived, breathless, following the sound of their mother's cries. They froze when they saw Emma, their faces draining of color as they took in the horrifying sight. Alex's voice cracked as he whispered, "What happened to her?" Daniel's hand gripped Maria's shoulder, trying to steady himself as he looked down at their daughter. The shock, the disbelief, was palpable. He bent down, holding Emma gently, tears brimming in his eyes. As the family huddled together, the realization began to settle in like a cold, suffocating weight. Something terrible had happened. And it wasn't an accident. This was no ordinary injury. This was deliberate. The police had to be called, but more than that, they knew there was someone responsible. Karen. She had been the one to harass Emma, to make her feel small, to make her feel like she didn't belong in the park. Now, She had crossed the line from cruelty to violence, and Emma was paying the price. They didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was certain: Karen had to be stopped. They wouldn't let Emma's pain be in vain. They would fight for her, for justice, and they would make sure Karen paid for what she had done. The family's unity had never been more important than it was right now, as they prepared to take on a woman who had hurt them in the worst way possible. The anger that had been building in the family over the past few hours finally reached its boiling point when they found themselves standing at the front door of Karen's house. Maria, Daniel, and Alex were trembling, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of injustice that had taken root deep inside them. They had rushed Emma to the hospital, and the doctors were doing everything they could, but every minute felt like a lifetime. As they stood on the doorstep of the woman who had caused their daughter so much pain, a sense of righteous fury surged through them. This wasn't just about physical injury anymore, this was about a family being torn apart by someone who thought they could break them. They had to face Karen. They had to know the truth. Maria's knuckles rapped against the door with a force that echoed through the empty street, as if every strike carried the weight of their suffering. They waited in the silence, hearts pounding, breaths shallow. The door creaked open, and there she stood, Karen. Her expression was unreadable, but the coldness in her eyes was unmistakable. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Maria's fists clenched at her sides as she met Karen's gaze. This was the woman who had terrorized her daughter, who had tried to destroy everything they held dear. This was the woman who had left Emma to die in the park, bleeding, ignored, and abandoned. Karen didn't flinch. She didn't seem surprised. Her lips curled slightly, a thin, almost smug smile playing at the edges of her mouth. "What is it now?" she asked, her voice cold and dismissive, as if she had done nothing more than disapprove of the neighbor's lawn ornaments. But Maria wasn't having any of it. She stepped forward, her voice thick with barely controlled rage. "Don't play innocent," Maria snapped, her voice trembling with fury. "You know exactly what you did. You hurt our daughter. You attacked her. Left her to bleed in the park while you walked away like nothing happened. What the hell is wrong with you?" Karen's eyes narrowed, and she took a step back, her posture defensive. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her tone flat, as if the truth were just a nuisance she had no time for. She caused a scene. She was in the way. It was an accident. I didn't mean for her to get hurt. She was making things difficult, and I just wanted her to stop." The audacity of her words left the family stunned for a moment. Karen didn't even look sorry. She wasn't remorseful. She was justifying it. The anger inside Maria surged again, hotter than before. "An accident?" Maria's voice cracked as she stepped forward, her body shaking with emotion. "You hit her with a pipe, Karen. You left her there, bleeding, helpless. That's not an accident, that's a premeditated act of violence. And you're standing here, acting like it's nothing." Karen's defiance only grew. "She was in my way," she repeated, the words dripping with venom. "She doesn't belong here. People like her don't belong in public spaces. She's a distraction. A nuisance. I warned you all before. You never listened. She was the one causing trouble. Not me." Her voice was cold, her words cutting deep like a knife. Daniel, who had remained silent up until this point, stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled fury. "No, Karen," he said, his voice low but steady. "You're the problem. You've been harassing our daughter for months. First, it was the complaints about her being in the park. Then it was the ridiculous HOA petitions. And now, this. You think this is justifiable?" His words were slow, deliberate, as if he were carefully weighing every syllable before it left his mouth. Karen didn't flinch. She crossed her arms, a smug smile creeping onto her face. "She made herself a target," she said, her words dripping with disdain. If she had just stayed out of my way, none of this would have happened. People like her shouldn't be outside. She was a disruption, and I took care of it. You should be thanking me for that. It was like a punch to the gut. The pure, unfiltered hatred in Karen's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't about Emma. This was about Karen's twisted view of the world, her need to control everything around her, to force her own perception of perfection on everyone else. It wasn't enough for her to simply make complaints. No, she had to take matters into her own hands, and she didn't care who got hurt along the way. Alex, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're sick," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "You actually think you're justified in doing this? What kind of person hurts a child? A disabled child, no less? You're a monster." His words rang out, raw with emotion. Karen's face remained impassive. She didn't seem bothered by the accusations. She didn't seem to care that her actions had nearly killed someone. She was cold, calculating, and detached from the reality of what she had done. Finally, Maria spoke again, her voice low but filled with determination. "You're going to pay for this, Karen," she said. "You'll be held accountable for what you did. You've crossed a line, and there's no going back. You've hurt our daughter, and you won't get away with it." Karen's gaze flickered, but she quickly masked it with a scoff. "You can't do anything. You don't have proof. No one will believe you over me." Her voice had a smugness to it, as if she had already won. Maria's expression hardened. "We don't need proof anymore. You've already confessed. And when we're done, you'll have to face the consequences for everything you've done to our family." The confrontation with Karen was far from over, but the family knew one thing for sure now: this was no accident. This was a deliberate act of hatred, and Karen's twisted view of the world had driven her to violence. They had come face to face with the monster they had only heard whispers about. And now, they would make sure that Karen would never hurt anyone again. The fight for justice had only just begun, and they wouldn't stop until it was won. The days following Emma's attack were filled with a whirlwind of emotions and uncertainty, but the family knew one thing: they couldn't let Karen get away with what she had done. Emma's recovery, both physically and emotionally, had become the focus of every waking moment. Her injuries were severe, but her resilience was even stronger. The hospital had provided medical documentation of the trauma she had suffered, the contusions, the internal injuries, the psychological toll of the attack, and it was clear that the brutal assault was not just a random act of violence. Karen's hatred had fueled it. And now, it was time for the family to make sure that she faced the consequences. The family consulted with attorneys, and soon, legal proceedings began in earnest. The district attorney's office reviewed the case, compiling the physical evidence, witness statements, and the consistent pattern of harassment that had led up to the attack. Karen, however, maintained her innocence. Her lawyers tried to argue that the incident was an accident, just a momentary loss of control, nothing more than a scuffle gone wrong, but the evidence told a different story. This was no accident. Karen had planned it. Her months of bullying, her obsession with controlling the park, and her callous disregard for Emma's safety all pointed to one clear conclusion: she had intentionally hurt Emma, and she had left her to die in the park. As the case moved forward, the neighborhood became divided. Some rallied behind the family, disgusted by Karen's actions, their hearts breaking for the suffering Emma had endured. They joined the family in the fight for justice, offering support and signing petitions, demanding that the truth be heard. Others, however, either remained silent or stood by Karen, unwilling to confront the reality of her cruelty. Some even tried to downplay the situation, suggesting that Emma had somehow provoked Karen, as if it were somehow her fault for being in the park at all. The division in the neighborhood felt like a wound that would never heal, but the family refused to be deterred. They knew that what mattered most was the truth. They had to make sure Emma's voice was heard, that the justice system saw Karen for what she truly was: a violent, hate-filled individual who had tried to destroy a child's life. As the case progressed, Karen was formally charged with assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder, and child endangerment. The charges were severe, and Karen's lawyers did everything they could to discredit the evidence and paint the family as unreliable. But the truth was on the family's side, and as they prepared for the trial, they focused on one thing: making sure Emma's story was told. Her courage to speak out, despite the trauma she had endured, became a central part of the case. She had been a victim, but now, she was also a fighter. Every day, Emma's recovery progressed a little further. She went through physical therapy, working hard to regain her strength, but she also attended every court session, her presence in the courtroom a powerful reminder of the stakes. The courtroom was intense, filled with emotions that surged to the surface with each passing testimony. The prosecution presented a clear, undeniable case. They highlighted Karen's previous acts of aggression, the repeated complaints, the history of cruelty. They showed how Karen had been fixated on Emma, watching her every move, harassing her at every opportunity. The attack in the park wasn't an isolated incident, it was the culmination of months of hatred, a culmination that led to Emma nearly losing her life. The defense, on the other hand, tried to paint Karen as a misunderstood, well-meaning woman who had simply been pushed too far. They argued that Karen's anger had been provoked, that she had only reacted in the heat of the moment. But the evidence didn't support that narrative. The family's legal team relentlessly pressed on, showing how Karen had acted with premeditated intent, how she had struck Emma with a pipe, a weapon designed to cause harm, and how she had left her there to die without a second thought. Throughout the trial, Emma remained composed, but her emotions were never far from the surface. There were times when she would squeeze her mother's hand, her eyes brimming with tears, unable to understand how someone could hurt her like that. But in the end, her bravery, her courage to face the woman who had done this to her, spoke louder than any words could. She didn't just want justice for herself. She wanted to make sure no one else had to experience the kind of cruelty she had endured. As the final arguments were made, the jury deliberated. The weight of the case, the facts, and the emotional testimony hung in the air. And when the verdict finally came down, it was clear: Karen was guilty. The courtroom was silent for a moment as the judge read the charges. Karen was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, the consequences of her actions finally catching up with her. The family, though exhausted, felt a sense of relief wash over them. Justice had been served, but the journey wasn't over. The emotional scars would remain, but Emma had proven her strength, her ability to endure, and her unyielding will to fight for what was right. In the end, they knew the trial had been about more than just winning a legal battle. It had been about reclaiming their lives, reclaiming their safety, and making sure that no one, could ever get away with something like this again. The fight for justice had been long, but in the end, it had brought them a sense of closure, and a hope that the darkness Karen had cast over their lives could never touch them again. Months had passed since the attack, and though Emma's physical wounds had begun to heal, the scars on her soul ran much deeper. The journey of recovery had been long and grueling, but every day, Emma grew stronger. She was learning to walk again, her legs trembling with the effort, but her determination never wavered. Each step she took, no matter how small, was a victory. She had faced the darkest moment of her life and survived, and now she was reclaiming her strength, piece by piece, step by step. But there were moments, quiet and still, when the weight of what had happened would settle over her, and the emotional scars would resurface. The flashbacks, the fear, the lingering doubt that came with being attacked in such a public space, it wasn't something that could simply be erased with time. It would take years, maybe a lifetime, to fully heal. The family stood together in the park one late afternoon, a place that had once been tainted by violence and terror, now filled with the quiet echoes of their reclaiming it. The park was no longer just the site of Emma's suffering. It had become a symbol of their resilience, a place where they had fought for justice, for healing, and for the promise of a brighter future. Emma, holding her parents' hands, looked around the familiar space with a new sense of ownership. She had not been broken, she had been transformed. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. "I'm okay now." Her family nodded, eyes glistening with pride and tears. They had walked through the fire together and come out stronger on the other side. They had faced down the worst a person could do, and yet, they had found the strength to stand again. The path to healing was not easy, but it had taught them invaluable lessons. The family had learned the importance of standing together, of never letting fear or hate silence them. They had learned that justice, no matter how long it took, could be achieved, and that no one, no matter how powerful, was above accountability. And they had learned that hope, no matter how small, could still grow in the most unlikely places. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were living, thriving, and most importantly, protecting others from suffering the same fate they had endured. As Emma looked out over the park, she took a deep breath, the air filled with the promise of new beginnings. "We won," she said quietly, as though affirming her own strength. And in that moment, the family knew it to be true. They had won. The fight for justice had been long, but they had emerged from the shadows, stronger, united, and unyielding.